You can choose your home, but you can't choose your neighbors. They are the strangers we live closest to, separated only by a wall or a stretch of lawn. But what happens when that proximity becomes a threat? What secrets are hidden behind their closed doors and polite waves? Tonight, we hear from 3 people who learned the terrifying truth. The greatest danger they ever faced was living right next door. For Helen, a retired school teacher in her late 60s, the front porch was her command center. It was from this comfortable wicker chair, with a glass of iced tea always within reach, that she observed the quiet, predictable rhythm of her suburban Denver neighborhood. She had lived in the same modest house for 40 years, and she knew the ebb and flow of the street by heart. The morning rush of commuters, the midday lull, the afternoon return of school buses and scattered laughter. So when the for sale sign on the house across the street finally came down, replaced by a sold banner, she watched with a keen, practiced interest. The new owner was a young man named David, a software developer who worked from home. He was quiet and kept to himself, a solitary figure she'd only see occasionally getting the mail or carrying in groceries. He seemed pleasant enough, if a bit reclusive. The one thing he neglected was the yard. The lawn grew shaggy, and the flower beds, once meticulously cared for by the previous owners, were now choked with weeds. So, Helen wasn't surprised when, a few weeks after he moved in, a small landscaping truck pulled up to the curb. The man who got out was unassuming. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face, a tidy graying mustache, and the sturdy, capable hands of someone who worked outdoors for a living. He introduced himself to David with a firm handshake, and for the next few weeks, he became a regular fixture on the street. He was a diligent worker, arriving every Tuesday and Friday morning like clockwork to mow, trim, and slowly reclaim the garden from its state of neglect. Helen found his presence reassuring. It was a sign of order being restored. But as the summer weeks wore on, Helen, from her porch-side perch, began to notice small, disquieting details in the gardener's routine. His work was efficient, but it was punctuated by long, still pauses. He would stop, mid-rake, and simply stare at the house. He wasn't admiring his handiwork. His gaze was fixed, intense, directed at the windows. He'd study the upstairs bedroom window, then the living room bay window, his expression unreadable. At first, she dismissed it. Perhaps he was just planning his next move, visualizing where to plant the new hydrangeas. Then, one afternoon, she saw him do something that couldn't be explained away. David had left for a rare in-person meeting, his car gone from the driveway. The gardener, thinking he was alone, finished mowing the lawn and then began a slow, deliberate patrol around the perimeter of the house. He walked close to the walls, his hand trailing along the siding, and with a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, he would gently try the latch on each ground floor window. He'd give a soft, exploratory push, and then, finding it locked, move on to the next. He did the same with the back door. It wasn't the action of a thief. It was too calm, too methodical. It was the action of someone taking inventory, testing for a weakness. A cold knot of unease began to form in Helen's stomach. His behavior grew stranger. A few days later, she saw him kneeling in one of the flower beds, not weeding, but whispering. His head was bowed, and his lips were moving, having a quiet, one-sided conversation with a rose bush. Another time, after finishing his work, he stood motionless on the front lawn for nearly 10 minutes, his back to the street, just staring at the front door as if locked in a silent standoff. He was no longer just a gardener. He was a sentry, a guardian of a post only he understood. Helen considered saying something to David, but what could she say? that his gardener was a bit eccentric? In a world of detached pleasantries, she felt it wasn't her place. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. David was at work. The gardener's truck pulled up, but he didn't get his tools out. He was wearing a clean polo shirt and slacks, not his usual work clothes. He walked up the driveway with a confident stride, his gaze fixed on the front door. He glanced left, then right. A quick, furtive check of the empty street. Then, he reached into his pocket, produced a key, inserted it into the lock, and let himself into David's house. Helen's heart leaped into her throat. This was no longer just strange behavior. This was a crime. Her hands shaking, she fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her voice a hushed, urgent whisper as she reported a break-in in progress. As she was on the line with the dispatcher, still watching from behind her own curtains, the front door of David's house opened again. The gardener stepped back out. He hadn't been inside for more than 2 minutes. He wasn't carrying anything. No television, no laptop, nothing. He pulled the door shut, and then he did the strangest thing of all. He turned back to the closed door, smiled warmly, and gave a small, friendly wave to the empty house. Then he walked calmly back to his truck and drove away. Minutes later, the quiet suburban street was flooded with the flashing lights of police cruisers. They surrounded the house, officers taking cover behind their car doors, expecting a confrontation. Helen watched as they called David, his voice a tinny, panicked sound over one of the officers' radios. He arrived 15 minutes later, his face pale with confusion and fear. He used his own key to open the door, and the police followed him inside, weapons drawn. Helen waited on her porch, her heart pounding. After a long, tense 20 minutes, a police officer crossed the street to speak with her. "Ma'am," he said, his face grim. "The house is clear. Nothing was stolen. Nothing appears to be disturbed." "But I saw him go inside," Helen insisted. "He had a key." Just then, David appeared in the doorway of his house, his face ashen. He was holding his phone, and he beckoned the officer back over. Helen watched as he showed the officer something on the screen. The officer's professional demeanor cracked, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. After a moment, the officer returned to Helen's porch. "We found something," he said, his voice now heavy. "In the master bedroom. On the bed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Dozens of Polaroid pictures, laid out in neat rows on the comforter. "Pictures of what?" Helen asked, though she was suddenly afraid to know the answer. The officer looked her straight in the eye. "Pictures of your neighbor, David. Pictures of him sleeping, taken from inside his bedroom, on many different nights. The police never found the gardener. The name and business information he had given David were completely fictitious. The key he used was a copy he must have made at some point. A silent betrayal David had never suspected. The realization that this quiet, unassuming man had been letting himself into his home, night after night, to stand over his bed and photograph him in his most vulnerable state, was a violation so profound it shattered David's sense of safety completely. He moved out within the week, abandoning the house and the garden that had been so lovingly tended by a monster. Helen still sits on her porch, but the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood no longer feels predictable or safe. She is haunted by the memory of the gardener, not as a thief or a threat of physical violence, but as something far more insidious. She thinks of him standing on the porch, smiling and waving goodbye to an empty house. Who had he been waving to? What was the purpose of the photographs? His motives were a complete and terrifying mystery. He hadn't wanted to take anything from the house. He had wanted to become a part of it, a silent, unseen observer in its most private moments. And it's that chilling, inexplicable intimacy that Helen sees every time she looks across the street. A permanent shadow lingering in a garden that is, once again, starting to overgrow with weeds. Sometimes, the danger isn't a stranger who forces their way in, but a neighbor who hides a terrifying secret behind a friendly smile and a locked door. When Leo moved into the Grove Student Housing Complex in January, he knew it wasn't a long-term solution. It was a place of last resort, a trio of squat brick apartment buildings on the frayed edge of a rust-belt college town, connected by a network of wind-swept, concrete walkways. The rent was cheap, and the room was available immediately. Two factors that outweighed the peeling paint and the perpetual scent of damp concrete in the hallways. The complex was a microcosm of university life. Loud undergrads, stressed-out graduate students, and the occasional, world-weary adjunct professor. But from his first day, Leo noticed one resident who didn't fit into any of these categories. Her name, he would later learn, was Evelyn. She was a woman in her late 60s, maybe older, with a cloud of untamed gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through you. She dressed in clothes that were decades out of style, high-collared blouses and long drab skirts, and she moved through the common areas with a ghostly, silent grace, while other residents bustled with the chaotic energy of academic life. Evelyn existed in a pocket of profound, unnerving stillness. Leo, a graduate student in literature, was trained to observe people, and there was something about Evelyn that he couldn't quite decipher. She was an anomaly, a living anachronism in a place defined by youth and forward momentum. His first direct encounter with her was in the shared laundry room. He was loading his clothes into a machine when he got the distinct, prickling feeling of being watched. He turned, and she was standing in the doorway, perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't say hello. She just watched him, her expression a complete blank. Leo offered a polite, awkward smile. "Hi, I'm Leo. I just moved into 2B. Evelyn didn't respond. Her gaze flickered from his face down to the laundry basket at his feet, and then back up. After a silence that stretched for an uncomfortable eternity, she simply turned and glided away down the hall. This became a pattern. He would see her in the periphery, a silent observer at the edge of his new life. She would stand at the far end of his building's hallway for an hour at a time, watching students come and go. One snowy evening, as he was studying in the ground floor common room, he looked up and saw her standing outside the large plate glass window. Snowflakes were melting in her gray hair, but she wore no coat, seemingly oblivious to the biting cold. She was just staring in at him, her face pale and indistinct in the winter twilight. The encounters grew more focused, more personal. He would step out of his apartment in the morning to find her standing directly across the hall, as if she had been waiting for his door to open. She would meet his gaze with those same empty eyes, and then turn and walk away without a word. The other residents seemed to have an unspoken agreement to simply ignore her. "Just pretend she's not there, man," a neighbor named Marco told him one day, shrugging. "She's harmless. Just part of the building." One frigid night, Leo was walking back from the university library, a bitter wind whipping through the concrete canyons of the Grove. As he fumbled with his keys at the entrance to his building, his wallet slipped from his pocket, falling silently into a fresh drift of snow. He didn't notice. It wasn't until he was back in the warmth of his apartment that he realized it was missing. Cursing himself, he retraced his steps, his eyes scanning the snow-covered walkway. As he rounded the corner, he saw her. Evelyn was standing directly under the buzzing, yellow glow of a security light, and in her hand, she was holding his wallet. A wave of relief washed over him. "Oh, thank God," he said, approaching her. "Thank you so much. I've been looking everywhere for this." Evelyn didn't hand it to him. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement, she opened the wallet. Her thin, pale fingers sifted through its contents before pulling out his university ID card. She held it close to her face, her eyes squinting at the small, smiling photograph. She was silent for a long moment, and then she whispered something, a dry, rustling sound that the wind almost carried away. "I'm sorry. What was that?" Leo asked, leaning closer. She lowered the ID and looked directly into his eyes. For the first time, her gaze wasn't empty. It was filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. "You have his eyes," she said, her voice a cracked, dusty whisper, as if it hadn't been used in years. Before Leo could process the strange, intimate declaration, she let the wallet and the ID fall from her hand into the snow at his feet. Then, she turned and disappeared into the shadows between the buildings. The encounter left Leo deeply shaken. "You have his eyes." The words echoed in his mind. Who was he? And why did this strange, silent woman see him in Leo's face? The unease he'd felt before now curdled into a genuine, creeping fear. A few nights later, he was woken by a sound from within his own room. It was a quiet, rhythmic snip, snip, snip. The sound of scissors. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart seizing in his chest. The room was pitch black, but his eyes were immediately drawn to his closet. The door was open a few inches, a sliver of deeper darkness in the gloom. He listened, holding his breath. The snipping sound came again, soft and precise, from inside the closet. He slid out of bed, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. How had someone gotten into his locked apartment? He crept across the cold floor, every instinct screaming at him to run. But an irrational need to confront the source of the sound propelled him forward. He reached the closet, took a deep, shaky breath, and flung the door open. Evelyn was there. She was huddled on the floor, surrounded by a strange collection of his personal belongings. A pen from his desk, a single balled-up sock, the novel he'd been reading, which now lay open on her lap. In her hands, she held a pair of sharp, silver sewing scissors, and she was using them to meticulously cut out his photograph from the pages of an old university yearbook that he didn't recognize. She didn't seem startled by his sudden appearance. She simply stopped her cutting, raised her head, and looked at him. And in the faint moonlight filtering through his window, he saw that she was smiling. It was not a happy smile. It was a vacant, disconnected, and utterly terrifying grimace. Leo screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure, undiluted terror. The smile vanished from Evelyn's face, replaced by a flash of confusion, then fear. She scrambled to her feet, dropping the scissors and the yearbook, and lunged past him, shoving him aside as she fled from the room and out of the apartment. The police came, as did the building manager. They found that Evelyn had used a stolen master key to enter his apartment. The full story came out later, pieced together from old university records and the hushed, forgotten memories of the town. Evelyn hadn't just been a resident. Decades ago, she had been Dr. Evelyn Reed, a brilliant and beloved English literature professor at the university. She had a son, a bright, popular student named Thomas. who was her entire world. 30 years ago, Thomas had been killed in a car accident just a few weeks before his graduation. The tragedy had broken her. She had a complete mental collapse from which she never recovered, eventually fading into the background of the university she once graced. A ghost haunting the halls of her own past, living in the student housing she had once helped oversee. Days later, driven by a morbid curiosity, Leo went to the university library's archives. He found the yearbook from the year Thomas Reed had died. He flipped through the pages until he found the student portraits. And there he was. A young man with a confident smile, dark hair, a strong jawline, and yes, he had Leo's eyes. Leo moved out of the grove the next day. He never found out what Evelyn had planned for the small, intimate collection of his belongings, or what she intended to do with the scissors and his photograph. He only knew that for a brief, terrifying period, he had stopped being a person to her. He had become a phantom, a living echo of a dead son, and she had been trying, in her own fractured, terrifying way, to bring him home. Sometimes, a neighbor's obsession is born from tragedy. Other times, it's fueled by something far darker, hidden behind a meticulously crafted illusion designed to lure you in. For an ambitious young journalist like Alex, a cryptic, anonymous tip was the lifeblood of his career. The email, sent from an encrypted address, was brief and tantalizing. Exclusive open house, a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity for a select few. Saturday, 8 p.m. It included the address of a sprawling, modernist mansion in a hyper-exclusive, gated community on the outskirts of Chicago. Alex had been working on a long-form piece about shadowy, high-stakes real estate fraud, and this felt like a direct invitation into the lion's den. He ironed his best shirt, polished his shoes, and crafted a believable cover story. He was a young tech heir, flush with cash and looking to diversify his portfolio. On Saturday night, a cold, biting wind swept across the flat Illinois landscape. He gave his fabricated name to the guard at the imposing wrought iron gates and was waved through. The neighborhood was a world unto itself, a collection of architectural marvels separated by vast, perfectly manicured lawns. The house itself was a fortress of glass and steel, glowing with a cold, white light against the dark winter sky. A row of luxury cars, Porsches, Bentleys, a matte black Lamborghini, were parked in the sweeping circular driveway. Alex took a deep breath and walked inside. He was met by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Sterling. He was in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with a charismatic smile and the predatory eyes of a shark. He welcomed Alex with a practiced, easy charm. The interior of the mansion was a temple of minimalist wealth. White walls, polished concrete floors, and sparse, artistic furniture. About a dozen other guests milled about the cavernous living room, holding champagne flutes and murmuring to one another. They were all older, dressed in designer clothes, dripping with the quiet confidence of the ultra-rich. But almost immediately, Alex felt that something was profoundly wrong. The atmosphere wasn't celebratory. It was sterile, almost theatrical. There was no music, just the low, polite hum of forced conversation. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and took a sip. It was flat, the bubbles long dead. He glanced at a platter of exquisite-looking hors d'oeuvres on a nearby table and realized they were plastic, the kind used for display in high-end furniture stores. The whole scene felt like a meticulously crafted stage play, and he had just walked in as an uninvited actor. The conversations he overheard were just as artificial. People spoke in vague, coded pleasantries about the market, potential yields, and mitigating risk. No one talked about the house itself, its architecture, its features, its price. They were actors, all of them, reciting lines from a script he didn't have. Then, he noticed the shoes. Despite the variety of designer suits and dresses, every single guest, including Mr. Sterling, was wearing the exact same model of plain, black, rubber-soled dress shoes. It was a small, bizarre detail, a crack in the flawless facade of the performance. Feigning the need for a restroom, Alex slipped away from the living room, his journalistic instincts screaming. He bypassed the guest bathroom and found a door tucked away beneath the main staircase. It was unlocked. He opened it to a set of steep, narrow stairs leading down into darkness. He pulled out his phone, its flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and descended. The basement was a stark, brutal contrast to the opulence above. It was a vast, unfinished space with cold, concrete walls and an exposed ceiling of pipes and wiring. The air was frigid and smelled sharply of bleach and antiseptic. The space was entirely empty, except for one corner. There, under the harsh, buzzing glare of a single, bare fluorescent light bulb, was a scene of clinical horror. A heavy stainless steel table, much like one you'd find in a morgue, stood in the center. Next to it was a wheeled tray holding a neat arrangement of gleaming medical instruments, scalpels, clamps, bone saws. And against the far wall, a large, industrial-grade chest freezer hummed ominously, its lid secured with a heavy padlock. This wasn't a wine cellar. It was a makeshift operating theater, a place for clean, efficient, and unspeakable work. As he was trying to process the terrifying implications of what he was seeing, he heard a soft, solid thud from above, the sound of the basement door closing. A moment later, the low hum of conversation from the party upstairs ceased. The performance was over. A wave of pure cold panic washed over him. He was trapped. He scrambled along the wall, his phone's light bouncing frantically, searching for another way out. He found one, a small, high window, the kind typically found in basements, partially obscured by an overgrown bush outside. He dragged a heavy, empty crate over, climbed on top, and after a struggle, managed to pry the window open. He squeezed through the narrow opening, thorns from the bush tearing at his clothes and skin, and tumbled out into the freezing night air. He crawled behind a row of dense hedges, his heart pounding in his ears. From his hiding place, he had a clear view into the mansion's glass-walled living room. The scene inside had changed dramatically. The guests were no longer mingling. They were standing in a silent semicircle, their backs to the window. In the center of the room, a new person had appeared. A man, bound tightly to a chair, his face bruised and bleeding. Mr. Sterling stood before him, no longer smiling. His expression was cold, businesslike. He was speaking to the bound man, his voice inaudible through the thick glass, but his gestures were sharp and menacing. The other guests watched, their faces impassive, like spectators at a grim, private auction. Alex didn't wait to see what happened next. He crawled away from the house, staying low in the shadows. Until he reached the edge of the property, he scaled the security fence and ran, not stopping until the glowing glass fortress was a distant memory. He called the police from a gas station miles away, his voice a torrent of panicked, barely coherent words. When the police finally raided the mansion an hour later, it was empty. Utterly, completely empty. The luxury cars were gone. The plastic food and flat champagne had vanished. In the basement, there was no steel table, no medical tools, no freezer. The concrete floor was clean, almost unnaturally so, though the faint, sharp scent of bleach still lingered in the air if you breathed in deep enough. The investigation hit a dead end before it even began. The property was owned by a shell corporation with an address in the Cayman Islands. The security guard at the front gate had no record of the cars or the guests Alex described. There was no trace of Mr. Sterling, no evidence that the open house had ever happened. It was a ghost event. Alex was left with a story he could never write, a story no one would believe. He had stumbled into a meticulously staged production, a piece of theater designed to provide a sterile, controlled environment for something monstrous. Was it a corporate interrogation, an organized crime hit, or something even more bizarre? He would never know. But he would forever be haunted by the image of those wealthy, silent figures in their identical black shoes, watching and waiting, and the chilling realization that he had been invited not as a guest, but as a potential future star of a show he was never meant to leave. The people we live beside are often the biggest mysteries. Behind a friendly wave, a polite smile, or a well-kept lawn can lie a darkness we can't begin to comprehend. These stories remind us that a locked door isn't always enough to keep the danger out. And sometimes, the most terrifying secrets are the ones being kept in plain sight. How well do you really know the people on your street? If you have a chilling story about a neighbor you'll never forget, share it in the comments below. Stay in the dark, subscribe, share, and never miss a scare.